There's idols and there's grace. You can cling to the idol and you can miss the grace. You can forfeit the idol and you can receive the grace. Think of the grace that could be yours. Now, what's the worthless idol? What's so good in your life that you would forfeit what God could do if you were unreservedly placed into his hands?
Welcome to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith. I'm David Pick, and today we're continuing our message, The God Who Will Not Tolerate Rivals, looking at idolatry in Micah in chapter 5. And Colin, we understand idolatry as anything we put in the place of God, but today we're going a lot deeper.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good place to begin, though. It's really worshipping created things rather than the Creator. That's a definition from Romans in chapter 1. And so we looked at what idolatry is last time. We looked a little bit at the question, why do idols exist? Because we're not seekers as much as we think. We're hide-and-seekers from God. We hide from him as often as we profess to seek him. Today we're going to look at some actual idols that can easily be set up in our lives. You know, when we hear the word idol, you might think of something that's very, very remote, you know, a metal image. Well, actually, it's a lot closer to home than that, and that's what we're going to see in the message today, and we're going to find how these idols can be smashed and brought down and God restored to his rightful place as the sovereign Lord of our lives.
So the message is from Micah chapter 5, so I hope you'll be able to join us there as we continue the message, The God Who Will Not Tolerate Rivals. Here's Colin.
Now, at first sight, I know that the subject of idolatry may seem remote from us, but I think as we get into this together, you will find, as I have found again, that it actually comes very close to home indeed. I want to approach this subject by asking 7 questions that I think will help us understand what God is saying here and what it means for us today. The first is very obvious. What is idolatry? And a very simple definition would be this, that idolatry is worshipping created things rather than the Creator. You find that definition in Romans chapter 1 and verse 25, where Paul speaks about those who have exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. That's what idolatry is, worshipping created things rather than the Creator. Here's the second question. Why do idols exist? And why do idols exist? 2 reasons. First, they exist because of our attraction to God. See, every human being is made in the image of God. That is true of the most messed up, dysfunctional, twisted person you can think of. And if the most messed up, dysfunctional, twisted person you can think of at this moment happens to be yourself, then it's true of you. So that's good news. You are made in the image of God, and nothing can ever change that. It's true of every person, in every culture, in every generation, and that is why wherever you go in the world, in history or in geography, you find human beings engaged in some kind of spiritual search. It can't be stamped out. Communism tried that and, of course, failed abysmally. There is a deep hunger for God that is imprinted in the soul of every person ever born into this world, a God-shaped hole at the center of every life that by definition, only God can fill. But that's only half of the answer. Why do idols exist? First, because of our attraction to God, which gets us kind of searching, but secondly, because of our avoidance of God. You see, any thoughtful person who looks at this world will quickly see, looking at the spectrum of religion, that there obviously is some kind of spiritual search going on. It's everywhere. But at the same time, any thoughtful person would be struck by the fact that there does not seem to be much coherence about this search. It's all over the place. Now, why is that? If there's one search, why is the search all over the place? Well, the reason for this is that alongside our deep attraction to God, human beings are also experts in avoiding God. So here is this strange enigma about our human nature, created in the image of God and yet fallen into our sinfulness. Because these things both constitute the reality of who we are, we on the one hand seek after God, but at the same time hide from him. The nature of the human condition is that we are hide and seekers. And you've got to know that there is no better place for hiding from God than religion. Because being religious allows you to think that you are spiritual while all the time you're bobbing and weaving and avoiding real confrontation with God in your life. Third question, what forms does idolatry take? Now let's look a little more closely at these verses that are before us here. Professor Walter Kaiser points out 4 dimensions of idolatry here in Micah chapter 5. The first is self-help. That's a form of idolatry. In verse 10, in that day declares the Lord, I will destroy your horses from among you and demolish your chariots. Now, horses and chariots in the Old Testament were usually associated with a spirit of self-confidence. We can do it. Believe in yourself. You've got the horses, that kind of thing. Well, you see, that's idolatry. Because the truth is that my next breath, my finishing this sermon, depends on the upholding hand of God's sustaining power that keeps me breathing moment by moment and keeps you breathing, even right now. I do not have life in myself. Only Christ has that. In a world that tells us there's nothing you can't do, what room is there for God in your life? That's idolatry. Secondly, self-defense. I will destroy the cities of your land and tear down your strongholds, verse 11. Here's the security that you build for yourself, the cities, the strongholds. A little different for us in our day, tends to be financial, doesn't it? The security I built for myself, my portfolio, the career, the achievements that have put me in a position of strength. It's idolatry to put your trust in that. Third, self-deception. I will destroy your witchcraft and you will no longer cast spells. I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that when men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. A very perceptive comment and speaks widely to our culture today. The spiritual search is all over the map because so many have lost confidence and trust in the living God who's made himself known in Jesus Christ. And then there's self-worship. Verse 13, I will destroy your carved images, your sacred stones from among you. You will no longer bow down to the work of your hands. What I've achieved, the work of my hands, what I've become, the work of my hands, the giftedness I've been given, what I'm able to offer in the marketplace, trust in these things. Idolatry. Now, here's the fourth question. Why is idolatry so offensive to God? And the answer to that question is simply that idolatry is a theft of identity. You see, God alone is God. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but everything in the created order belongs to a class. There are planets, there are fish, there are birds, there are animals, there are humans, there are angels, and so forth and so on. But everything in the created order belongs to a class. But God is in a class of his own. Now, what idolatry wants to do in our time, of course, is to say that there is a class called God, and anything that claims to be God belongs in that class. That is completely opposite to what the God of the universe, the Creator, says to us, to whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? He is in a class of his own. And that means that anyone or anything that wants to pose as God is stealing the identity that belongs only to him. Idolatry is a theft of identity. During the summer, my son Andrew was working selling books in Rhode Island. He got into a routine in which early in the day he went training, changed and showered and so forth before he went running at the YMCA. One day, he put his stuff in the locker just a few moments while he was in the shower, came back, got dressed, then discovered that his bank card had disappeared from his wallet. Well, he did the right thing, called the bank, found that within an hour, whoever had taken the card had spent several $100s. That's identity theft. Taking what belongs to another person as if it were your own. Now, whenever anyone or anything in the created order takes the place of first importance, you're dealing with the ultimate case of identity theft. Only God is God. I am the Lord, he says, and beside me there is no other. To whom will you compare me? And the offense of idolatry is that something or someone in the created order dares to pose in the place of God.
You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith, and we're going to pause our message briefly there, but we'll be back in just a moment. The message today is from Micah in chapter 5, and it's called The God Who Will Not Tolerate Rivals, all about the problem of idolatry. And don't forget, if you ever miss one of our messages, or if you want to go back and listen again, you can always do that by coming online to our website, openthebible.org.uk. There you can find all of our previously broadcast messages. And you can also find us as a podcast if that's a better way for you to keep up with Pastor Colin's teaching. And those are available on all the major podcasting sites, either by following a link from our website or by going directly to the podcast site and searching for Open the Bible UK. Back to the message now. Here's Colin.
What will God do with the idols? That's the fifth question. And the answer that Micah gives us, very simply, is that God will destroy every idol and will vindicate his own name. He speaks of a day coming when God will, and let's focus on what he says here. I hope you have it open in front of you. Will you just look at the verbs just to see how clearly God speaks here? What he says he will do, verse 10, I will destroy, demolish. Verse 11, destroy, tear down. Verse 12, destroy. Verse 13, destroy. Verse 14, uproot and demolish. Verse 15, take vengeance. Not the most popular words, but that is what God says. And I want you to notice not only the verbs here, but I want you to notice the subject. God is telling us that this is something he will do. Notice it. I will destroy your horses. I will destroy your chariots. I will destroy your cities. I will destroy your witchcraft. I will destroy your carved images. I will uproot your Asherah poles. I will take vengeance in anger and wrath. Just look down these verses. I will, I will, I will. 6 times. I'll do it. Now, by the way, that's very important. God does not tell us to do these things. He's not calling us to direct action. He says, there will come a day when I will do it myself. It's very important. Very important. Our warfare is spiritual. The destruction of the idols, God himself will take care of. That's what he says. But what he says is that there will come a day when he himself will take direct action and will dethrone all other gods. It's a wonderful story in the Old Testament that gives us a picture of God's direct action. You can read it in 1 Samuel chapter 5. It's the story of when the ark of the Lord was captured by the Philistines. Do you remember this? And it was taken off to the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god. And they put the ark of the Lord, the enemies of God's people, put the ark of the Lord on a shelf in the temple of Dagon, shut it up for the night. The attendant went home, had a lovely night's sleep, and then came back in the morning. And guess what he found? That in the presence of the ark of the Lord, Dagon, inexplicably, had fallen off his perch. The idol was on the floor. So the attendant, rather disturbed by this, picked the idol up, dusted it off, put it back on its stand. The next morning he came back, guess what had happened? The idol had fallen off the stand, only this time its head had smashed on the floor and its palms were lying severed from the body. God himself will dethrone all the other gods and will be glorified throughout the universe for all eternity. He will vindicate his own name. That's the message of Micah in chapter 5. It's taken up in the New Testament, of course, where we're told it this way: every eye will see, every knee will bow, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Do you believe that? So here's the sixth question. What should we do about our idols? And the answer is very simply, we've got to turn from them. You have this beautifully expressed in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 9, where Paul writes about some believers and he describes the miracle that has happened in their lives. He says, you turned to God from idols to serve the living and the true God. That's what we've got to do. John the apostle writes in his New Testament letters to Christian believers, he says, little children, here's what you've got to do: flee from idols. This is for us. You were made for a God-centered life. You were made to glorify him and to enjoy him forever. Turning from idols means letting God at last be God in your life. It's to recognize what will be the eternal reality of the universe and to let it begin in you right now. That you worship him. That you love him for who he is. And no longer seek to use him as a means to an end. Because trying to use God as a means to an end is, of course, just a form of idolatry. John Piper makes this point, I think, quite brilliantly. He says, I cannot say to my wife, I feel a strong delight in you so that you will make me a nice meal. That is not the way that delight works. It terminates on her. It does not have a nice meal in view. I cannot say to my son, I love playing ball with you so that you will cut the grass. If my heart really delights in playing ball with him, that delight cannot be performed as a means of getting him to do something. See, if you say to your wife or your son that you love them because you want a nice meal or because you want them to cut the grass, that's not love. We have another word for it: manipulation. Try and do that with God. You're putting yourself in the place of God, trying to manipulate him. That's idolatry. So when something that you want from God becomes more important than God himself to you, you're slipped into idolatry. You come to see God as a provider of your wish list that is in a higher place than God himself. Well, then it's time to turn from idols. Maybe that leaves you saying, well, I can see that. I can see I'm much more of an idolater than I ever thought I was. I can see that I need to turn from idols, but how in the world am I going to do that? They have a very strong hold in my life. There's a one-word answer to that question, how can I turn from idols? And it's simply the word grace. See, maybe you're drawn to God right now as the Spirit speaks to you, but something inside you holds back. You say, yeah, I am drawn, but how do I overcome this avoidance that I see within me? Listen, that is why Jesus Christ has come into the world. He came to seek and save the lost. He told a story about a lost sheep wandering off so far that the sheep couldn't find its way back, but the shepherd goes and gets the sheep and brings it back. Christ came into the world because he loves you. So he came to bring you back, to seek and to save you from your idolatry. He gave himself on the cross so that our idolatry might be cleansed and forgiven. He came so that by his Spirit you would be weaned off self-love and become a true worshiper and lover of God for his own sake. And he reaches out to embrace you even where you're hiding from him in the trees. I'll tell you, it takes a lot of energy to go on resisting love like that. that reaches out to you wherever you're hiding today. So what's your idol? What's the created thing that you've put in the place of God? Is it relationships, career, reputation, personal goals, some pleasure? Just before the book of Micah, there's the story of Jonah. Great story about a man who had a great ministry. Things were going just fine in his life until God upset him. Jonah didn't like what was happening in his life, so he put himself in the place of God and started moving in the opposite direction. Then things didn't go so well. Eventually, they found himself in the stomach of a great fish, and that's where he came to his senses. And he began to pray, and in Jonah 2:8, this is what he said: "Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs." Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. There's idols and there's grace. You can cling to the idol and you can miss the grace. You can forfeit the idol and you can receive the grace. Think of the grace that could be yours. Saving grace, redeeming grace, grace to make you more like Jesus, grace for service, for ministry, gifts of grace. Think of the grace that could be yours. Now, what's the worthless idol? What's so good in your life that you would forfeit what God could do if you were unreservedly placed into his hands? See, Jonah had been a believing man for years. But in his darkest hour, he came to the place of saying, I've been a fool. I've been clinging to a worthless idol, and I've lost out. And I can't live like that any longer. And God's grace reached out to him in the belly of a fish. And then when the fish brought him up the next morning on the beach, he moved forward into a new life, a whole new chapter in his usefulness to God. You know, that could happen for you today.
Challenging words today. God will not tolerate rivals, so we have to find a way to get rid of those idols in our lives. You're listening to Open the Bible with Pastor Colin Smith, and a message today, The God Who Will Not Tolerate Rivals, part of our series, Close Encounters with the Living God. And don't forget, if you ever miss one of the series, or if you want to go back and listen again, you can do that by coming online to our website, openthebible.org.uk, or find us as a podcast. And those are available on all the major podcasting sites. Search for Open the Bible UK and subscribe to receive regular updates. Open the Bible is supported entirely by our listeners. That's people just like you. And if that's something you're considering doing, this month we have an offer for you. If you're able to set up a new donation to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more, we'd love to thank you by sending you a copy of Kevin DeYoung's book, Impossible Christianity. Colin, what would you hope that someone reading this book will take away from it?
Well, Kevin DeYoung does a brilliant job of distinguishing between the life that God calls us to lead and the sometimes impossible burdens that we place on ourselves. And that's why it's such a helpful and such a liberating book. For example, when he talks about prayer, he talks about the importance of prayer. And anyone who really walks with the Lord knows that. We often feel that we need to pray more. We can live under a burden of saying, have I ever prayed enough? And have I ever prayed as sincerely and deeply as I ought? And we end up putting burdens on ourselves that can easily make following Christ feel like a joyless experience. And so I've found Impossible Christianity to be really helpful in just restoring a sense of perspective, a sense of peace to the soul, and it's right out of the scriptures. It's faithful to what God says, but it brings to us a sense of a life that is made possible by the grace of God as we follow hard after the Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, we'd love to send you a copy of Kevin DeYoung's book. to say thank you for setting up a new donation to the work of Open the Bible in the amount of £5 per month or more. Full details of this offer are on our website, openthebible.org.uk. For Open the Bible and Pastor Colin Smith, I'm David Pick, and I hope you'll be able to join us again next time. Some people feel that the Lord has let them down, that he's placed an intolerable burden on them. Find out how this can lead to faith next time on Open the Bible.